Well, I'm not sure what you talked about with your family over the Christmas holidays, but there's an old proverb that says that when your family comes together, you shouldn't talk about religion or about politics. And maybe we can add taxes to the mix. So we could be on dangerous ground today because our sermon today talks about politics, about money, and about taxes. So it really sounds like a recipe for trouble. But the people who bring up all three of these things are actually intentionally looking for trouble. We noted last week that at the beginning of this final week of Jesus' life, at the beginning of Luke chapter 20, the religious leaders are trying to get rid of Jesus, and they are going to do that whatever the cost and whatever it takes. And they want to do two things. They want to discredit Jesus because people are flocking to him to hear his teaching, and his influence is growing greater than theirs, and they don't like that. But more than that, they actually want him dead. And the text in all four of the Gospels make it very clear that from this point on, even before his final week of life has begun, they have been actively plotting his death. Now, don't miss the great irony of that statement. These men are supposed to be the religious leaders of their people. Their focus is supposed to be the keeping of the commandments. But their hatred for Jesus is such that they're willing to break at least 4 or 5 of the commandments. They're coveting the respect he has from the crowds. They're willing to lie and cheat and even perjure themselves and bear false witness in open court to get rid of him. And they're actually plotting what amounts to a murder. But they have a couple of problems if they want Jesus dead. First, they're not willing to get their own hands dirty, and that's usually the way it is with bullies. They're cunning and they're deceitful, and they typically manage to get other people to do their dirty work. The second problem they have is that under the rules of Roman occupation, they have authority over most of the ordinary civil matters, particularly about those things that concern the temple, but they don't have authority over what we might consider to be the heavier items of criminal law. This means that the religious leaders can impose a number of penalties on the people, but they do not have the authority to impose capital punishment. Now, under the regular Levitical laws, there were a number of offenses that carried the penalty of death, and that the religious leaders might have imposed. That would include things like blasphemy and adultery, but not in this case. The Romans did not impose death penalty for those offenses. In fact, adultery was run-of-the-mill for the Romans. And they don't allow the Jewish religious leaders to punish by death for adultery. So what the religious leaders have to do is they have to make Jesus appear guilty of a charge that warrants the death penalty in the eyes of the Roman occupiers. They have to get Jesus to say something or to do something that will make him guilty of a criminal offense in the eyes of the Romans. And we'll see this in full force when they get to the trial before Pilate. When the religious leaders arrest Jesus and turn him over to Pilate, they accuse him of two things. They accuse him of sedition, of trying to challenge the authority of the Roman government, which carried a death penalty. And then they accused him of threatening the temple, which strangely, in the eyes of the Romans, also carried the death penalty. Surprisingly, the pagans that they were, the Romans took religion very seriously. And they protected shrines and idol temples of all kinds, including the Jewish one in Jerusalem. Threatening, damaging, or destroying a place of worship carried the possibility of a death penalty. So when they bring Jesus before Pilate eventually, they charge him with two things: sedition, trying to foment revolt against the emperor, and 2, threatening the temple, because those two things carried the death penalty. Now, in their public exchange with Jesus, we're still on Tuesday of Holy Week, we think, in the text we're reading today, they're going to begin to try and lay the charge of sedition. A couple bright members of the religious leaders have come up with a trap question that they're hoping will corner Jesus between two terrible options. Now, remember we said there are 5, they're going to try this 5 times. They're coming in with 5 different questions, with 5 different arguments to try and get him in trouble. There was the first one last week. We've got the second one this week. They're going to ask him a question which has only 2 possible answers. And one of the 2 answers will get Jesus in trouble with the Roman authorities, and the other one will get him in trouble with the people who are flocking to hear his teaching. And actually, they're really crafty this time. Their first attempt, they came themselves, and Jesus realized what was going on. So this time, they get somebody else to do their dirty work for them. They get somebody who's not one of them. The text calls them a spy. We don't know exactly who it was, but it was somebody who maybe was wearing a hat and false glasses and a fake mustache or something. We don't know how he disguised his identity, but he comes to Jesus as a spy on behalf of the religious leaders with this little tricky question. And they begin by trying to flatter Jesus. They have obviously no idea that Jesus is not swayed by flattery, and he sees right through them. Now, this isn't bad advice, by the way. When somebody approaches you with flattery and a bunch of compliments like this, be on your guard. Either they're trying to trap you, or even worse, they're trying to get you to do a favor for them. So when somebody approaches you with a bunch of compliments and flattery, be on your guard. You know something's up. And so we pick up our text today with a response to the parable. You remember the parable Jesus told last week about the vine, and it was a pretty bad parable for the religious leaders, and they realized the parable is about them, and that's where we pick up in Luke 20, starting at verse 19. The scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him at that very hour, for they perceived that he had told this parable against them, but they feared the people. So they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be sincere, that they might catch him in something he said, so as to deliver him up to the authority and jurisdiction of the governor. So they asked him, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly, and show no partiality, but truly teach the way of God." There's the flattery. They're butting it on pretty thick. Here's the question, is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not? But he perceived their craftiness. And he said to them, "Show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have?" They said, "Caesar's." He said to them, "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were not able in the presence of the people to catch him in what he said, but marveling at his answer, they became silent. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, some time ago on Sunday morning, we did a little series that looked at some of the very accurate things that were said about Jesus by his enemies. And many of these statements his enemies made about him, trying to accuse him or to detract him. But in fact, as they said these things, thinking to accuse him, they were actually compliments, and they were true of Jesus. You remember at one point, Pilate, after examining Jesus, says, "I find no fault in him." You remember at one point when the Pharisees are upset at Jesus, they say he's a friend of sinners. All things that his enemies used to attack him, but that were actually true of him. The opening lines of flattery from the spies who come to trap Jesus sound really fake in the mouths of his attackers, but when you look at them, they're actually really accurate statement. They say, "We know that you speak and teach rightly. We know that you show no partiality, but that you only teach the way of God." These things are certainly true about Jesus. But they're not here to compliment him. They're here with the trap. And here's the trap. Is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not? Now, the Jews of Jesus' day paid three kinds of taxes. A little bit like us. You pay taxes to the city on your house and to the province and to the federal government. And well, they had three kinds of taxes that they paid. The first was a tax that they didn't mind paying. It was called the temple tax. Most of them gladly paid it because the temple tax helped to keep the temple going. It helped to cover the operating costs and the maintenance costs of the building. Now, at the point when Jesus is there, some of them didn't like the temple tax too much because it was under the control of Herod, who was renovating the temple and using the money. He'd made the temple a beautiful place. They were glad about that. They were glad the temple was protected. But at least out of the three taxes, it was the one tax that went to something that they saw that they thought was practical, that they liked to use in the temple. Then there were several types of taxes that were paid as a part of carrying out daily business in ordinary life. When you went from one territory to another, you would often pay a toll using the highway. When you did business, often there was a tax that you would pay on goods that were imported, that were brought in, or that were sold. And there were a variety of these taxes that were charged on various forms of business. They were just a part of the ordinary course of doing business within the Roman Empire. But the third tax, this is the one that really frustrated the Jewish people, and indeed the people from all the nations that the Romans conquered. It was the tribute. It was the head tax. This is a tax that you paid simply for the privilege of having been conquered and being administered by the Roman government. And it was a constant reminder that you were a conquered people. The very zealous nationalistic Jews considered it a sin to pay this tribute to a foreign pagan government because it affirmed the subjugation of the people of God to a foreign power. And so you remember Judas, who was a zealot, and there were a couple of the other zealots. They actually taught to pay this tribute to Caesar is like giving money to the devil. This is a sin. You shouldn't do this, and you should do whatever you can to get out of paying this tribute and this head tax. And to add insult to injury, the tribute could not be paid in Jewish currency. You couldn't use your Jewish money. You couldn't use temple currency. This tax had to be paid with Roman coins. And these coins were very, very offensive to the Jews. I don't know if you saw on the opening slide of the PowerPoint this morning, there was one of the denarius coins that we found, and those coins always had the imprint, the image of the head of one of the emperors. This was offensive to the Jews because God had told them that you can't make carved images representing people. And so all of the Jewish coins had other things but not living beings and not people on them. And as a good case in point, the most common denarius, and likely the one that was used to pay the tribute in Jesus' day, had two offensive sides. On the front of this coin was an image of Caesar with the inscription, Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus. Not only was there the image of a human being on it that you weren't supposed to have if you were a good Jew, but on top of that, it suggested that Tiberius' father, Augustus, was divine, was somehow a god, and that was blasphemy. And on the other side was an image of Tiberius' mother, Livia. She was portrayed as the goddess Pax, the goddess of peace, with the inscription that she was the high priest to God. It doesn't get more offensive than thinking of a woman being a high priest. And so the Jews hated this coin. I'm not sure which one was more offensive, having to pay the tribute with a blasphemous coin, or having to pay the tribute with a blasphemous coin that suggests that it was possible for a woman to be a high priest. The most zealous nationalistic Jews said it was sin to pay the tribute. And worse than that, if you were a devout Jew, you shouldn't be caught dead handling this blasphemous, idolatrous money because it broke several commandments. And it is this third tax, this tribute paid with this denarius, that the little sly, deceitful, crafty spy asks Jesus about. Is it okay to pay this tribute to Caesar? It appears to be a no-win situation. There appears to be no answer that won't get him into trouble. If he says that you shouldn't pay the tribute to Caesar, then the Roman authorities will come and arrest him for sedition because he's telling people not to pay their taxes to the emperor. If he says it's okay to pay the tribute, then the people will get upset at him because they don't like to have to pay the tribute and they won't like Jesus anymore. They think they've got Jesus cornered. But this is Jesus. He's just a little smarter than they are. And his response is masterful in several ways. I got to tell you, this is one of the texts in Luke. Luke has me chuckling so often when I'm reading through the text. And this is one of those texts that I can't get through without breaking into guffaws sometimes. Now, I want you to consider carefully what Jesus does in response. First, he asks them whether they have a denarius, the kind of hated denarius they needed to use to pay the hated tribute. The kind of currency that really good devout Jews would not be caught dead carrying. This is pretty crafty. I'm not sure I should tell you this, but I've got a little plate at home on my bedstand next to the alarm clock, and it's a little plate I use, and I throw loose change, and I throw keys in there, and my watch there at the end of the day. And there's a couple of items that have sort of collected there that for a variety of reasons have become meaningful to me. A couple years ago, a friend of mine got in trouble, and I got called when the police were on their way to arrest him. And so I got there before the police did, and after the police arrived, I managed to negotiate so things didn't get too far out of hand. And as the police moved in and were about to strap him down and get him to the ambulance, he had to empty his pockets. And as he emptied his pockets, there were keys and other things. And don't ask me why this has become meaningful to me, but he had a bad habit of smoking these little pocket cigars. And as I took several things from him, including one of his apartment keys, in this little pocket cigar, and they wound up in my pocket. When I got home that night, and as I emptied my pockets and my keys, there was this little cigar that to me has become a reminder of my friend and of the difficulty and the challenge that he's been through, first in jail and then at the Douglas, in a number of places in and out. And it's not a strong thought, it just it's just there. And when I see it, I'm reminded not just of my friend, but of several other people that I've helped through the process of incarceration and the Douglas and that difficult process. And a couple of months ago, somebody was at the house, happened to walk by and said, "What are you doing with the cigar in your nightstand? Oh, this is our pastor. Do you smoke? What are you?" And I had to explain to him why I had this thing. Now, you need to understand at this moment, when Jesus looks at the crowd and said, "Does any one of you have a denarius?" I mean, he may as well have been asking whether any of them had a gram of Coke in their pocket in a little white baggie. Because this is a bad denarius. This is a piece of idolatry. The good Jews knew that you don't handle this denarius. So as Jesus looks around at this crowd that's accusing him and says, "Does any one of you have one of these hated, blasphemous, idolatrous denarius?" There's this awkward moment of silence as everybody looks around and shifts and jingles with the change in their pocket and doesn't win. So finally one says, "Yes, I have one, here it is," and with his head held low in shame and embarrassment, says, "Okay, yeah, I've got one of the bad coins, I'm not supposed to." So they hand them this denarius. Not bad for a first step. If you're keeping score, Team Jesus 1, scribes and Pharisees 0. And then Jesus does the smart rabbi thing. You remember we said last week, when you're a rabbi and somebody asks you a hard question, you don't answer the question. What do? You ask them the question in return. Is it lawful to pay the tribute to Caesar? Jesus says, whose likeness and inscription does it have? And the denarius, of course, carries the inscription of Caesar. If you're keeping score, it's now 2-0 for Jesus. And then after all that, finally comes Jesus' masterful response. And this is amazing. It's a response that not only answers the question, that not only cuts through the layers of malarkey and controversy they're trying to throw at him, but he does that by making an insightful pronouncement that actually gets at the depth of our relationship between our allegiance to God and our allegiance to the government. It's surprising that one of these great, insightful statements of Jesus actually comes in response to a trick question they used to try and trap him. So in response to this great deception, he could easily have responded with a throw-off line that dodged the question. He easily could have said something sarcastic or humorous in return. But he redeems the moment and he uses it to teach a precept that is of huge importance. Now, there's a great side application here for you. Sometimes at work or in your family, you get trapped in one of these questions. You know, with these people who think religion is stupid, who don't believe in God, who think Jesus, well, you know, whatever. And in the middle of a conversation, you realize they're making all these stupid throw-off comments and they try and corner you with. And you know what the temptation is? The temptation often is either to respond with sarcasm or just to shut up and not to say anything. And I'm impressed that in those moments, the Lord Jesus always redeems the moment. He doesn't drop to their level of sarcasm. He doesn't respond in anger. He actually uses the moment to say something very perceptive and very insightful. Now, let's look at Jesus' answer for a minute. Notice first that as Jesus answers, he reframes the question with a very intentional choice of words. When they asked the question, they asked, is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar? Their word choice suggests that they're giving something to Caesar as a gift that he hasn't deserved, that he hasn't earned. When I'm paying this tribute to Caesar, I'm giving him something. He's taking something from me. He's robbing from me. I'm giving him something for absolutely no reason. It's like a gift that I have to give to him. When Jesus responds, he uses another word. He doesn't say give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. You remember the word he uses? He says render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. This is not about giving a gift, says Jesus. This is about rendering something to somebody to whom it is due. This is about paying for something that you have received and paying in return. This is about payment for work that has been done, for a service that you have been provided. The Roman government provided administration, provided security, policed the temple and kept it safe, kept the roads, built the roads that would allow the gospel to be proclaimed after the death of Jesus, performed a number of services that were helpful not only to unbelievers and pagans, but to Christians and good Jews as well. And Jesus' very intentional use of the word render instead of gift suggests that we're not giving something to Caesar. It's money owed because there's something we have received. We pay our taxes to the government because there's something that we receive to the government, and we don't give taxes. We render our taxes because it is due. Now bear in mind, Jesus is not talking about the best, most democratic government you've ever seen. There was certainly a lot wrong with the government of Tiberius that Jesus could have criticized. And Tiberius himself wasn't the most moral, upstanding leader you've ever seen. And yes, that very government was at that very moment oppressing people, including Jews and eventually Christians. But the fact was that the tribute paid to Rome helped to provide and maintain the roads on which they walked, policing and security, the trade routes of the empire, and dozens of other things that Jesus and the disciples and his followers would use in the years to come to proclaim the gospel. So the first part of Jesus' answer affirms not just the principle of taxation, but also the wider basic respect that we owe to the governing authorities placed over us by God himself. Paul will revisit this issue several times, most notably in the book of Romans, where we're encouraged not just to submit to the authorities, but even to pray for them, even if they happen to be authorities who make our life difficult as Christians. Now, I have to tell you, as a pastor, this taxation issue is one that may surprise you, but I face fairly often. As I work with some of the cemeteries and do a lot of funerals and do a lot of weddings in the community, there's these innuendos about how ministers and priests or clergy are paid for doing these things. When I started doing this about 12, 13 years ago, I don't do this for the money. We do this to serve the families. But many of the families will pay an honorarium as a matter of course, for a funeral or for a wedding that's performed. And apparently, a lot of the ministers in the city insisted to be paid cash in an envelope without a receipt. And you know why they insisted that. And I've apparently gotten in trouble with a couple of my colleagues because when I do the work, the cemetery, it's easier for them to pay me with a check. They pay me with a check. There's an invoice at the end of the month, and there's a paper trail, because for me, every one of those finds its way onto my income tax report, and everything is reported. I want you to know that when I do a baptism, when I do a wedding for you, if you slip me $20 in an envelope, that goes on my tax at the end of the year. This is money on which I owe taxes to the government, and it's reported that way. Taxes that we give to the government are not a gift. We do not give to Caesar what is not Caesar's. We render to Caesar's what is due to Caesar. Now, intriguingly, Jesus uses the word render to Caesar, but there's another little word that he uses to connect the two parts of his response. He says, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and render to God what is God's. The conjunction there is interesting. Jesus doesn't say that we render to Caesar what is Caesar's, but we render to God what is God's. So there's this little pile of stuff over here that belongs to Caesar. That's the stuff we give to Caesar. And there's a little pile over here, hopefully a little bigger, is the stuff that belongs to God. We give that stuff to God. And there's two separate piles. That's not what Jesus is saying. The way Jesus uses the construction suggests that there might be some overlap. Now, I apologize for doing this, but the only way to do this was to do a little math lesson. I apologize to Rebecca if I get this wrong this morning. But I want to talk to you for a second about Venn diagrams. Some of you are back at class, and I'm sorry, you're going to roll your eyes at me. Do you remember Venn diagrams? Okay, let me explain this really easily, all right? Here's a slide with a bunch of dogs and cats, all right? This is how you make math easy. You use cute puppies and dogs. That makes the math lesson really easy, okay? Now, let's say we've got a circle that contains all the dogs, all right? There you go. First circle, my left, red. Now, let's do a circle that contains all the cats. We'll do that one in blue. You've got your first Venn diagram, dogs and cats. Now, notice that the circle of dogs and cats don't overlap. Unless you're doing some weird biology experiment with DNA somewhere, your circles of dogs and cats should not overlap. But what if we change the circles a little bit? What if the circles aren't dogs and cats? What if the circles are dogs and my pets at home? Well, that circle might overlap because there's my circle with the dogs, and the circle that includes my pets, there's a budgie, and there's a Siamese cat, and there's a dog, and there's my little goldfish that is surviving out of its fish tank for a few minutes while I use this illustration. So you see there's an overlap between the two. So sometimes Venn diagrams overlap, and the little terrier dog in the middle is both one of my pets and part of the circle that belongs to the dogs. Now, let's take Venn diagrams a step further. Sometimes two Venn diagrams don't only intersect, but sometimes one of them is entirely inside the other. So, for instance, Labrador retrievers, golden Labrador retrievers. There we go. We got them circled. But let's make a circle that includes all the dogs. They go, see how that circle is completely inside the other one? This is a Venn diagram, right? This is the circle that contains all the Labrador retrievers is completely circled by the circle that includes dogs. All right, why am I telling you all this? All right, let's move on to the next slide. Sometimes we think that Jesus' response, expressed as a Venn diagram, is there's the pile of stuff that belongs to God, and there's the pile of stuff that belongs to Caesar, and the two are separate. This is not what Jesus is saying. Jesus is in fact saying that there's a little circle of stuff that belongs to Caesar, and that little circle that belongs to Caesar is part of a much larger circle of everything that belongs to God. Now here's our problem for most of us. We'd like to have a little circle on the side that's the stuff that belongs to me, all right? The little green circle of the stuff that belongs to me, where should it be? It should be in the big red circle, right? Jesus isn't saying there's three little piles, God's pile, Caesar's pile, and my pile. Jesus is saying, yes, there's some things that we owe to Caesar, that we render to Caesar's. But ultimately, all of it belonged to God. If you follow Jesus' argument, the denarius belongs to Caesar, is rendered to Caesar's because it's got Caesar's image on it. I wonder at what has God's image on it. Now, the hard question, of course, is what do we do at those moments when rendering something to Caesar is in contradiction with rendering something to God? What do we do when Caesar asks something of us that contradicts the will of God? And what do we do when refusing what Caesar would want gets dangerous and even life-threatening? I thought it was very, very interesting that Jesus makes this statement on Tuesday, and then on Thursday he will be on trial before Pilate. And when Pilate tells him, don't you answer me? Don't you know I have the authority to crucify you or to save your life? Remember what Jesus says, you would have no authority over me unless God gave it to you. And so on Friday, as the Lord Jesus Christ goes to the cross, on the one hand, he is rendering to Caesar's what is Caesar's. He has been condemned and found guilty in the eyes of the law. He goes to his death willingly, submitting to that evil authority over him. And yet, strangely, at the same time, as he is submitting to the authority of Caesar and Pilate and the cruel authorities of the religious leaders over him, far more importantly, he is rendering to God what is God's as he willingly goes to his death for you and for me. Let's pray together. Father, I was going to pray and tell you that most of us have pockets full of change with pictures of prime ministers and kings and queens, but that's not true. I guess most of us just have a debit card in our wallet. But Father, you know we make these little piles. There are these little piles of stuff that we think we need to render to the government. There's that little pile of stuff we want to render to you, and there's a pile of stuff that we think is ours to do with as we wish. Father, teach us to render to Caesar's what is Caesar's, and to render to God what is God's. This is our prayer. Amen.